Está prendido el micrófono.
Estamos en el momento en que pero vamos a empezar a la secuencia de su código de todo.
Siempre programa presentado que hace que todo sea compatible con el PC, pero sí, por eso no sé, tengo la misma función de convertirlo en leer en los computadores. Estamos en eso.
Pero no le cambio la mano. Y pasó bien.
Sí, todo bien. Le estamos bajando unos gráficos que la verdad es que la comunicación no es así. Entonces, le preguntamos los gráficos.
Y a partir de eso.
Y a partir de eso.
Bueno. No, gracias. Muchísimas gracias.
Sorry for wasting time. Oh, I should have emailed. We can actually start before I get the graphs,
Okay.
if you want, so that we can save time, yeah.
Well, you first. Present the book.
Okay, for how long? What period of time?
20 minutes.
Okay.
If you want. And then Rodrigo,
Okay,
then Carlos,
uh-huh. Okay,
you prefer to close the discussion at the end, no?
okay,
It's good for you?
yeah,
Okay. CD in English, no? I present in Spanish, and no.
oh, this is in English, yes.
You know,
I believe so.
okay. Well,
Of course, I know
¿ya
Rodrigo.
tenemos audio? Ah.
Mhm.
Bueno, si les parece, miren, vamos a hacer la charla. Ustedes, como recordarán, pueden hacer igual preguntas en español o en inglés, pero como se va a grabar, quería decir, por más, ¿no? Y no hay inconveniente. La presentación va a ser muy breve, 20 minutos máximo cada uno. Vamos a empezar con la presentación del profesor Flynn, un poco para poner el contexto, y luego vienen los comentarios. Primero Rodrigo, después el profesor Carlos Panico, y finalmente.
Thank you.
Después una réplica, si fuese el caso, ¿no? La discusión, y luego viene la pregunta. Estamos como un poco en familia y no sé cuántos estén conectados, pero si están conectados y nos están escuchando, ¿quieres ver si hay audio?
Por lo menos no está donde está. Yo estoy hablando.
Nosotros estamos hablando. En el momento en que se prende el micrófono. Okay. Bueno.
Me dice Iván que sí tenemos audio.
Bueno, ok. Bueno. Después se dice. Cuando tú me digas, ¿ya está? Ya tienes los... Okay. Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Seguimos nuestro seminario sobre la plata con el profesor Dennis Flynn. En esta ocasión vamos a comentar su libro. Él nos va a hacer una presentación breve sobre los ejes del texto. Y tenemos para esta ocasión 3 comentaristas que van a hacer desde distintos puntos de vista una discusión sobre el libro. Thank you very much, Professor Flynn, for coming. Y bueno, vamos a dar paso entonces, en primer lugar, ¿no? Welcome again.
Thank you.
No? You start the discussion. Okay.
Okay. I'm going to be like Isabella. Isabella likes to stand up, me too. Can I do that? You can hear me okay?
Yes.
You can hear me all right?
Escucha,
Okay.
¿no?
Well,
Sí, está prendido. Sí.
first of all, I'm going to put on a timer here because otherwise I'll automatically go for an hour at least. And so, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Antonio and all of you for inviting me here. Okay. Thank you for inviting me here, and also Carlos Marechal, we had a very nice lunch a few days ago with him, and I've known him for quite a long time. Wonderful man. And okay, so I had quite a few comments to make. I'm going to try to do it as briefly as I can because many of you have already read some of the chapters that I sent of this proposed book. But just for a history of the thought process. So in 1974, I didn't know any history. I wanted to at least know something about something, and so in economic history, they actually offered it at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And so my second year, we could choose fields, and I decided to do a sequence of courses on economic history. And of course, that was at the time just after OPEC and the quadrupling of oil prices in the world and around the world. And the United States, we had double-digit price inflation and double-digit unemployment. Now, all the textbooks at the time said you could get one or the other, but you couldn't get both at the same time, right? I'm glad I wasn't a professor then because the textbooks all said the opposite. But so I wasn't going to get the answer out of the textbooks, and so I decided maybe history would be a good teacher. The very first professor I had, I said, there must be famous times of price inflation. Could you suggest a topic? I knew I had to write a paper on something. And he said, why don't you do the price revolution? And I said, cool. I had no clue. Pyramids? I mean, I don't know. And so that's the way I came in, completely ignorant about history. And so it turns out I did what any young aspiring professor would do. I took, and I was fortunate enough to have from a new faculty member to learn about something called the monetary approach to the balance of payments. So it turned out that I ended up using that. That's what economists do. We take our theory and we apply it to some historical period of time. And it did a good job, a partial job, but did a good job. But there was one part of my explanation that answered questions in a way, kind of ended a debate. But underneath it, what the classical economists had always said, and they were right, Adam Smith and Karl Marx and all of them, they said that the reason for the price revolution was because the market value of silver took 100 years. Economists are not accustomed to thinking about equilibrium 100 years later, but the market value of the silver came down to the low cost of production in the Americas, including in Mexico and Potosi, et cetera, upper Peru. And I said, that makes intuitive sense. It makes perfect sense, right? But nobody could model it, and nobody ever had modeled it. And so I was interested in communicating with historians because in the United States, economists had no interest in such topics at all. And so I just put together a vertical supply curve for silver because it accumulates over time, right? It doesn't make sense to say the current year's production is the supply. It lasts for even centuries. So I had my vertical supply curve, and without thinking very much about it, I just slapped a demand curve on top of that supply curve and made an argument about, super profits, and it supported the Spanish Empire, and eventually the stock of silver had moved out so far that it had depressed the price of silver to its cost of production. Fine. There was a little problem here. The problem, I'm sitting in my office by myself. This is a few years later when I was a young assistant professor at University of the Pacific. And I'm sitting in my office, and every semester I was teaching intermediate microeconomic theory and some upper division also. But And I'm saying, well, where did I get that demand curve? Well, I got the demand curve out of microeconomic theory. It's a standard, right? Consumer demand. But it dawned on me all of a sudden, I was so embarrassed. It dawned on me that, wait a minute, that demand curve is defined on the quantity axis as units per time period. I've got an accumulation supply function, which is defined as units. You can't put those two functions in the same space because they're not defined in the same space, right? It's like trying to compare your height with your weight or something like that. I mean, it's just gibberish. It makes no sense. So I go to my mathematical economist colleague, who also I was a graduate student with him as well, Kerry Doherty. Now, he was a good mathematical economist. And I went to him and I said, Kerry, I can't believe that I made this mistake. And it's even published in a few obscure places. And I said, you're so good at mathematics. I just want a stock. I called it inventory. Now I call it ownership demand. And you're so good at mathematics, let's work together a couple weekends and give me the demand curve that I need in order to not make a fool of myself every time I give a talk. And so he said, it's not quite as easy as you think. And I said, oh, you're being too humble. And so he and I, he had worked on his dissertation, totally different topic. He had used something called, at that time pretty new in econ, optimal control theory as a form of dynamic mathematics. And so he said, maybe this would be a way to go. He and I met constantly, multiple times a week for 3 years. And he was manipulating mathematics and trying to cancel things down just to find some expression that even looked familiar, all this mathematics. And after 3 years of doing this and being confused, both of us most of the time, the mathematics suddenly spits out 3 demand functions at the same time. And we're like, what? What the hell is this? Really, we were completely baffled. And then, but the more we thought about it, we said, oh, actually, this actually makes sense. So it wasn't that we had the great insight and therefore mathematized it. No, we mathematized something and it gave us the insight. I didn't realize that mathematics was that powerful. And so the 3 demand functions were purchase demand, what I now call ownership demand, and consumption demand. Well, standard economics says that consumption is the sole source of utility. But in our model, there are 2 sources of utility: consumption, just like regular econ, but also ownership, wealth, in other words, a wealth component. My wife and I, we own our home. Are we glad that we own our home rather than rent? Hell yes. And all the things that a person owns, do they give you satisfaction? Well, let me put it this way. If somebody comes and steals it, are you dissatisfied? Of course you are, right? So therefore having it must. So anyway, and then, so the model, it goes like, and those of you who have already read this will know this already. I use the example of beer. I'm sorry about that. One of my friends, she said, why did you use beer? That's a male white example and everything. I said, oh man, I can't redo it because each one of those lines and each one of those graphs was done individually with software that wasn't designed for this purpose. And so I can't go back and change it all. But the idea is, let's say it's beer, in my case it's wine because I'm gluten intolerant. So if I have 6 bottles of wine at home and I want to have 12, well, the 6 that I have, I call that ownership supply. That's what I've got. The 12 that I wish to have and can afford to also is 12, right? Well, how do I solve this problem? I ask my students, and eventually one of them will say, buy it. Go out and buy some. I say, Bingo, that's right. So that's purchase demand, right? And if you purchase, that's a flow that comes in, you build the stock up from 6 bottles to 12 bottles, right? Now, how about, but I'm buying this wine not just to look at it. I drink it every evening. I admit it. And when I drink it, it decreases the stock, right? And so standard economics has one demand curve, laws of supply and demand, has one demand curve, consumption demand, and then without ever saying it, it is also conflated with purchase demand. Not only are they not the same thing, they have opposite functions, right? And the same thing on the supply side. Now, this part, Carrie and I never did mathematically, and he died at a young age, and I lost my mathematical economist. But the supply side, we never mathematized, but from a common sense point of view, we've got 3 supply functions as well. You've got production supply. If you produce more wine, then the stock of wine goes up, right? If you sell it off, your stock of wine declines, right? Once again, in the laws of supply and demand, standard econ, they conflate production supply and sales supply, which is completely absurd because production supply means you've got a bigger stock, and if you sell it off, you've got a smaller stock. So they have actually the opposite function, okay? So in chapter 2, which I think I'm not even going to use the visuals at this point because it'll take me too long. So in chapter 2, I set up the simplest model that I could possibly think of. We got a family that brews this liquid, and you've got 20 customers, and they start out, they're all the same. They're clones of each other, right? They buy the same amount of beer every week. They drink the same amount. They hold at certain times during the week the stock that they want, etc. And the production family. Now, this model already immediately is much different than standard econ, because in standard econ, consumption demand and the demand side is one side of the textbook. Production theory is a completely different side of, right? And you're either a customer or you're a producer. You can't be both. But in my model, of course you could be both. You mean to tell me that a winery, people who grow the grapes and make wine, they don't drink their own wine? Of course they do. And they don't have a stock of it? Of course they do, right? And so it's much more realistic in that way, right? So then we go through an example, and one of the customers gets an inheritance, and her demand function to purchase, consume, and store shifts. Everyone else stays the same. I'm trying to keep it as simple as I possibly can, right? And it turns out that it takes several periods. The customers, they can adjust their themselves very quickly. I mean, I want to drink 2 bottles of wine. I drink 2 bottles of wine, and I'm quickly where I want to be. Or same thing with purchase. But the producer has a much more complex problem. And the producer has a much more complex problem. And in chapter 2, I try to show that it's all the way into week 5 before the producer is trying to get back to a steady state, right? And here's the amazing part, to me, a shocking part. I didn't even know this myself until I started drawing these graphs and putting them together, is that the producer has a very difficult problem because has no control over sales. Because you'll notice in the chapter, I put, what are they called, Excel files down below. And the reason I put the Excel files down there is because, yeah, they're simple graphs, but you've got production last week, you've got your stock now, and you've got consumption coming later. So it's really dynamic. You're not stuck like you are in standard econ with this is a snapshot picture, comparative statics. This one's doing the past, the present, and the future all in one set of graphs. And so what happened was I assumed that the law of supply, sales supply would be positively sloped. I mean, I taught it for 50 years. And it turns out when I did that, the numbers didn't come out. And I said to myself, I went for several walks near our home, breathing some fresh air. I thought, you know, I'm old now, and I'm losing my mental capacity, right? This can't be right. And so that's when I went to these Excel files. And what it said on the Excel file, I finally realized, I said, wow, this is absolutely stunning. Purchase demand and sales supply are not related to each other, they're identical. In other words, the store sells something, you go into the store, your purchase is the sale of the store, right? You say, what theory connects the two? There is no theory, they're the same damn thing, right? But if that's the case, then the sales supply function has to be negatively sloped because the purchase demand function is negatively sloped. I'm saying, wow, this blows up the law of supply. The law of supply, we've only got the laws of supply and demand, and already the law of supply is out the window, right? Okay, so then, let's see. I'm using up time, but let me hit a couple of highlights. So then chapter 3, which I didn't send to you, but chapter 3, and this, Carrie Doherty and I in the 80s, we were sitting there trying to figure this stuff out. And Carrie says, well, let's put into the mathematics, let's put in, what if the product can't be stocked, right? It's not stockable. And the further assumption is you're either on the supply side or the demand side, like regular econ says, you're either a customer or a producer. So we do that. And then what happened was, and this shocked us at first too, is we had 3 supply functions and 3 demand functions. We've got 6 functions here. And guess what? When we said it wasn't stockable, and we suddenly realized, economists, we always talk about goods and services. It's like one word. Goods and services, right? What's the difference between a good and a service? A good can be stocked and a service can't. End of story. There is no other difference, right? And so what happened was in chapter 3, it's a short chapter, but it shows that our model boils down to the standard laws of supply and demand. And we're saying, wow, that's amazing. So microeconomics, the laws of supply and demand, are a special case of our model. And it's a special case that only applies to services. Only to services, not to goods, right? Well, why is that such a shocking statement? Because it means that modern economics, which is all flows, including macro too, micro and macroeconomics, only applies to services, which means that everything you can see, touch, measure, everything on this planet, including ourselves, is inheritance from the past, right? It's a stock, is excluded. So I'm saying, wow. I remember giving talks one time, and Walter Alvarez, who's a very, very famous geologist, one of the most famous in the world, was in the audience, and he and other scientists burst out laughing when I said, overlooking the tangible world, I think is a pretty big oversight, right? They say, yeah, I would say so. Okay, so we move on, and chapter 4 has some interesting things in it, but I won't talk about, like, for example, negative prices can exist in our model. It's impossible for laws of supply and demand are only in that one quadrant, right? They're positives, positive price and positive quantity. But wasn't that many years ago when the price of crude oil dropped to $35 per barrel negative. you can't explain that using the laws of supply and demand, but in our model you can. And so there are a bunch of other stuff going in there. And then we move to chapter 5, which is the one that relates mostly to the silver question, of course. And that is monies, right? And so, but monies fit right into it, because one thing economists did get right, I argue that aggregating for M being an aggregate of all kinds of different monies, if you do that historically, you're guaranteed loss for life. There's no coming back, right? Doesn't make any sense, because each of those monetary substances were produced separately in a separate place, ended up in different end markets, and they never traveled together, the four main monies in the world, right? The only way you can understand them is to disaggregate, which is our model does. And then when you do that, then you can start talking about the Mexican peso, for example. And not only the Mexican peso, but which Mexican peso are you talking about? Because in China, they gave premium price to the Carolus dollar, as we know from Irigoyen, and so on. And so our model says that you have to bring it down to the each individual money. That's why I call it purposely a price theory of monies, plural, not money aggregated, monies individually, right? Each has its own price theory that applies to each individual monetary, identifiable monetary object, whether it's a coin or not. And so by doing this, when you integrate the monies into this model, you don't need micro, macro anymore, because macroeconomics, I argue, I know it's a contentious position, but I argue that macroeconomics, I mean, we didn't even have the words micro and macro before the 20th century. Before that, there was just value theory, right? And this is a return to that kind of thinking, because macroeconomics became a dumping ground for everything that didn't fit into utility analysis, especially monies. And so now that you've got a model where you can put the monies directly in as what I call a wealth component, like other wealth components, what do you need a separate macroeconomics for? You don't. Now, there are a lot of insights that you get from standard theory, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying dump everything, but that from a theoretical point of view, it's a unified theory of prices, I call it. And with that, of course, there's all the birth of globalization and all the historical stuff, which is where the model came from, really. But you know that already, and I think I've already exceeded my, not too bad, but I think I'll stop.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Professor Flynn, for this explication. Well, it's the moment for the dialogue. Okay. Let me. Okay. First, Rodrigo Gordoa is a PhD in modern and contemporary history for the Mora Institute in Mexico. His research focuses on the study of the jurisdictional dimension of the government of the royal treasure in Spain, the 16th and 17th centuries. The problem is about the tax evasion of silver produced in Spain. And you know, this is a very important problem for the crisis of the 17th century. And now is doing postdoctoral work of the Posgrado in Economía with us. Very good student. Wow, doctor. No? Thank you so much, Rodrigo.
Do you want this?
Or this, whatever you want.
Bueno, creo que mejor este.
Órale.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todas, a todos quienes están aquí y quienes nos acompañan a través de las redes. Bien, voy a hacer mi exposición breve Trataré en la medida de lo posible de hacerla de manera bilingüe, por lo tanto va a ser un poquito más corta mi intervención que el resto de los colegas. Voy a empezar en inglés y después voy a hacer una brevísima traducción al español. Professor Dennis O'Flynn's new book offers an interesting opportunity of dialogue between economists who are interested in the past and us, the so-called archival historians. From a theoretical perspective, Professor Flynn's critical approach to standard monetary theory is suggestive and, of course, polemic, which is a fantastic opportunity to bring up a friendly and much-needed dialogue between economic historians and other thinkers such as standard historians, sociologists, or anthropologists, ¿no? El nuevo libro del profesor Dennis nos ofrece una oportunidad muy interesante de diálogo entre aquellos aquellas economistas que se interesan en el pasado y quienes somos nombrados en el libro del doctor como historiadores o historiadoras de archivo, ¿no? Desde una perspectiva teórica, el profesor Flynn presenta una aproximación crítica a la teoría estándar, teoría cuantitativa del dinero y, bueno, es a la vez propositiva y polémica, ¿no? Y por lo tanto creo que es una oportunidad muy interesante de un diálogo pues necesario entre la disciplina de la economía, que nos dedicamos a la historia y pues otras disciplinas, ¿no? His skepticism on the predominant use of standard quantitative theory of money is, I hope so, shared among many of the people who are in today's panel. But until now, we lack a formalized approach or a systematic hypothesis to contradict a dominant perspective in economic history. After reading the sections of the book, I can tell that we will have a theoretical frame that we will be discussing with concrete empirical work, some of them shared last Friday, and I hope that my first impressions can be an invitation to start such a dialogue with historians. Bueno, básicamente que su mirada un tanto escéptica a la teoría estándar nos permite de alguna manera pues acceder a lo que ya señalaba el doctor de esta nueva forma, valga la redundancia, de formalizar desde la teoría económica pues una realidad un poco más compleja de aquella que solemos replicar o tomar algunos modelos desde la historia e intentar pues de alguna manera que encajen o que estén de alguna manera próximos a nuestros temas de investigación, ¿no? Después de leer las secciones del libro, pues puedo asegurar que tendremos un marco teórico que pues va a generar muchas discusiones, ¿no? Sobre todo creo que el valor radica en cuestionar ese modelo o enriquecerlo a partir del trabajo empírico con casos específicos, ¿no? Entonces, muchas de estas investigaciones en curso se presentaron el viernes pasado y bueno, estas impresiones que estoy presentándoles, estas opiniones, pues son como una invitación al diálogo, ¿no? The first aspect that I want to highlight is his constructive criticism on how the money or monies demand worked as a coordinated model of flows from the production centers to those places where silver, gold, or other monies had a considerable demand. Since his classic text co-authored with Giraldes, we had the opportunity to understand how the silver, for example, flowed from New Spain and Peru to from the American market to the Chinese pool of money. Y bueno, lo primero que quisiera subrayar es que su crítica constructiva sobre cómo funciona la demanda de dinero pues ya viene de un trabajo previo con Giraldes, ¿no? Sobre todo señalando cómo se coordinaban esta serie de flujos desde la producción hasta los centros de demanda y principalmente, pues como ejemplo, desde Nueva España y Perú a través de distintos circuitos hacia pues aquella alberca de dinero o alberca de plata que era China, ¿no? Now it is clear that most of the historiographical approaches and economic models lacked a basic aspect of the money demand. Society's demand of goods and the cultural relation with money changes over time. It is not possible to understand the ancient regime demand of silver and gold without a crucial characteristic, the clear tendency to accumulate money as any other valuable and durable good. Ahora está claro desde aproximaciones historiográficas y desde otros modelos económicos que hemos obviado un aspecto fundamental de la demanda monetaria, ¿no? Las sociedades lo que hacen es demandar bienes y bueno, la relación cultural con esos bienes, en específico con el dinero, cambian a lo largo del tiempo, ¿no? Por lo tanto, pues no es posible entender, sobre todo sociedades de antiguo régimen, sobre todo esas demandas de plata y oro, sin tomar en cuenta una característica crucial, ¿no? La tendencia clarísima de estas sociedades a acumular dinero como una fuente de metales preciosos y pues la acumulan en tanto en cuanto, como señala el doctor, como un bien deseado, un bien que dura a lo largo del tiempo y un bien valioso, valga la expresión, ¿no? The concept of ownership demand integrates, from an economist perspective, cultural aspects that archival historians find regularly. Church decorations in Mexico, Seville or Cusco, the use of Spanish coins in Apache colors, Indian palaces, or in the Chinese court are just some examples of the different use of monies that standard economic theory tends to eliminate to preserve the leitmotif other things equal, ¿no? Bueno, el concepto de demanda por propiedad lo que hace es integrar desde una perspectiva de un economista que se acerca al pasado aspectos culturales que los historiadores e historiadoras de archivo encontramos regularmente, ¿no? Las decoraciones, por ejemplo, en las iglesias en México, Sevilla o Cusco, el uso, por ejemplo, de moneda hispánica en los collares tradicionales de sociedades como los apaches, ¿no? Los palacios en el subcontinente asiático o la demanda china de plata en la corte, ¿no? Y bueno, estos son como algunos ejemplos de los diferentes usos de estos dineros monetarios, valga la expresión, o más bien dineros expresados en términos de metales preciosos, que la teoría económica estándar, ¿no? Ya discutiremos a qué nos referimos con eso, elimina para preservar pues una constante, ¿no? Todo permanece constante, ¿no? Another aspect that I want to notice is Professor Flynn's open call to develop case studies on how the different kind of money or money's demand worked for at least the last 400 years. This global theoretical framework is designed to be tested, or at least that's my impression as a non-economist. In the first chapter, we can see some specific examples of how ownership demand changed over time and in multiple contexts. The Chinese shifts on the relation between paper and silver, specifically the 1430s paper collapse and the rise of demand and holdings of silver. European silver production, for instance, gravitated to Chinese end markets. In this point, it's remarkable how the author debunked the common hypothesis about the European trade deficit, ¿no? Y bueno, otro aspecto que me pareció interesante fue la llamada abierta a hacer o a analizar estudios de caso. En el primer capítulo presenta varios, ¿no? Me centro sobre todo en aquel pues enfocado en China, ¿no? Con el sistema monetario que era basado en papel pero respaldado en plata, y cómo a partir de, pues si se quiere, la trayectoria de esta relación, lo que podemos ver es cómo a partir de la década de 1430, el colapso del sistema monetario por papel lo que hace es engendrar lo que es pues la atracción de plata, sobre todo de Europa, ¿no? Pero aquí uno de los matices interesantes es que no es a partir de lo que hasta ahora se había pensado, ¿no? Que era una forma de cubrir el déficit en la balanza de pagos de demanda de bienes europeos con el influjo de plata hacia China, ¿no? Lo que estamos viendo aquí es simplemente cómo se balancean dos polos que lo que hacen es demandar diferentes bienes, ¿no? And I just wanted to share that this theoretical framework it's suggestive and I find it really interesting. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of elements that we can discuss later. First of those aspects is, I think, from the production perspective, it's that we need to focus through some case studies that most of the production costs were really high during the 17th century, for example. And those costs of production tends to transform utility or the margin of gain all the way to zero. So what I was thinking about is how can we not fall in the trap of making generalizations, especially from the supply perspective. I just wanted to highlight my doubts about how can we measure cost of production, for example, in different places like Taxco in New Spain, or for example, in Oruro, in Alto Peru, or in other places, in order to have a wider idea of there are some places that the cost of productions weren't that severe, or in other cases we had like different problems with supplies that were quickly solved with different technological innovation. No? So there's some aspects that I want to highlight, like cost of production and how technology and innovation can influence in supply. Básicamente comunico dos dudas desde el campo de la historia, ¿no? La primera es intentar, pues, no caer en la trampa de generalizar en exceso, ¿no? Desde la parte, sobre todo, de la oferta, donde los costos de producción va a haber un margen de ganancia más o menos equiparable, que en el texto lo que hace es, pues de alguna forma, colocar en América hispánica esos costos de manera similar, pero bueno, no va a ser lo mismo tener factores de producción en Tasco, en Oruro o en otras minas, y tampoco va a ser lo mismo las soluciones que van a aplicar al reto de mantener la demanda, ¿no? Simplemente como agrego algunas de estas interrogantes, sobre todo en torno a las dificultades desde la producción o los costos de producción, y cómo en este esquema va a influir el factor de la innovación, cómo avanza la tecnología a lo largo del tiempo justo para solventar este tipo de problemas. I just wanted to, I'm just on time, I just wanted to thank the opportunity to read the draft of this book, and I think that I've learned a lot as a non-economist. And if the main goal is to call up historians to discuss from an economic theory perspective, historical process, I think that, well, the call is successful in the point that I really enjoyed, and I have many questions, which is, I think, one of the main goals of our research, not to get to answers, but to open the field to new questions. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Nada más cerraría diciendo que pues, estoy agradecido con leer este texto, que uno de los objetivos de las investigaciones, creo yo, es no llegar a preguntas, sino formular, perdón, llegar a respuestas, sino formular nuevas preguntas, ¿no? Y pues bueno, como alguien que no es economista, valoro mucho esta intención de abrir el diálogo desde la teoría económica a quienes no nos formamos pues desde una academia de economía, ¿no? Y pues muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. The view of the historian, the young historian, and very good historian. Thank you. Well, now Professor Carlo Panico is full professor in Faculty of Economics in UNAM, but he was PhD in Economic and Commerce from the Federico II University in Naples, in Nápoles, en la bellísima Nápoles, and Economics and Politics in Cambridge University. He has professor in the University of Federico II, and other university in Italy and UNAM, and has visiting professor at several universities in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. He's member of Queen's College in Cambridge, and the Italian Society of Economists, the Italian Society for the Study of Economic Thought, and the Society for the Historian of Economics, and the European for the Story and Economic Philosophy. And he's a good professor of economic theory in our program. Well, Carlo, it's a pleasure. Listen to you. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion, for everything. Well, I have this presentation. Professor Flynn is stimulating, and raises issue in relation between theory and history that are worth discussing. I mean, I'm really pleased to discuss this thing because I've always been interested in this particular relation between theory and history. I won't discuss with the thing that you raised, with the issue that you raised here, the issue which is basically a problem of consumption, demand, and supply. And I think that when we have to discuss this problem and try to produce a new theory on this matter, we have to go to the very basics first of all, no? And you discuss mainly in terms of partial equilibrium, well, but the theoretical foundation of the theory are in terms of general equilibrium. So one has to try to relate the two things. And what's more, I mean, if you look at the problem of consumption in general, in the history of economic thought, there are different approaches that have to be pointed out. So I won't discuss this, although I'm interested very much in this issue. And in particular, the relation, well, we have different theories since Adam Smith, Ricardo on one side, Bentham on the other side. And then the psychological rationalism of Bentham dominated in the neoclassical theory, but we have alternative theories, including the United States institutional school of thought, which is quite important on this side. And the real point is the relation between individual behavior and the behavior of society. I think this cannot be put aside when we want to construct a new theory on that. And in particular, the relation, well, the interpretation of society, whether it is a organized or a disorganized complexity, which is at the center of discussion in the 20th century in particular. But I won't discuss that. I will go on another problem, much more to the basics of what is the relation between theory, history, and policy, which is an issue that's very open to large discussion. And I found that there is huge amount of problems and confusion whenever we go through the literature. I was trained by my teachers to look quite carefully at this problem because it's a great source of error, in particular from the point of view of scientific method. And I will try to discuss then. The first point I want to discuss, which I welcome, regards the quantity theory of money plus the price-specie flow mechanism that you mentioned in the book. The book criticized, let me see it here, I have two things to look after. The book criticized the application of the quantity theory of the money to historical events, which are welcome, no? I think it is quite, I have no intention at all to defend the quantity theory of money, which I think is very limited and not very useful for interpreting historical facts. But, I mean, I will pretend that I wanted to see how we can go to the criticism of this theory, more than criticize it directly. I also enjoyed reading the application of this theory to southern Italian region. I come from there, so I really enjoyed it. During the 16th century. Recalling the work of Carlo Cipolla, the book criticized this theory by noticing that its conclusions are contradicted by the behavior of the price level during those historical events. This is a central point of how to criticize theories, starting with history. I'm not criticizing Cipolla. I mean, he's saying what he observes in the history. I mean, but I want to have some critical words towards those who think that if Cipolla is right, then automatically the quantity theory of money is wrong. I think this is not the way to solve the problem. Criticizing a theory by saying that historical events contradict its conclusions raises problems regarding the scientific methodologies adopted to describe the relation among theory, history, and policy. What happened in southern Italy regions during the 16th century can be the result that are not of forces that are not included in the construction of the quantity theory of money, which is an abstract theory, so it does not have to include all historical events. For instance, the economic effect generated by the need of the Spanish crown to force the southern Italian social group to obey and to pay taxes may play a role, no? But on that. Sorry, I'm getting lucky. The problem of the actual resistance of forces not included in the construction of a theory was at the center of important debate in different disciplines, including economics. The economic disciplines dealt with the issue in two outstanding debates developed during the same years of the 19th century. There is the debate between Menger and the German Historical School, and the debate which was very similar, between Marshall and Cunningham in the UK. They were contemporary, they dealt with the same issue. Marshall's 1984 inaugural lecture, after winning the chair of political economy in Cambridge, rejecting the position of Cunningham and also of the German History School on the relation between theory, history, and policies, and imposed a methodological approach that characterized the Cambridge tradition for several years afterwards. I would say up to when I was in Cambridge, because I saw the change in the 70s there. Marshall described this methodological approach by stating that political economy, like other sciences, must identify general principles that will no doubt be presented, this is a quote, all the part in red are all quotes, will no doubt be presented as a perfectly pure and abstract theories. The validity of these theories, Marshall said, must be verified in terms of logical coherence. This means it's different. This means that alternative theories can be evaluated by identifying the assumptions required to make them logical coherent and by comparing the realism of the assumption, not of the conclusion. This is the important point. The comparison allows one to evaluate the strengths of the theory and the limits of their use in the interpretation of events and the formulation of policies. Marshall specified that the set of theories constituting the general principle of political economy, this is a quotation from Marshall, it is not a body of concrete truth, but an engine for the discovery of concrete truth. Similar to, say, the theory of mechanics that supply a universal engine which will help in determining what strain any bridge will bear. But he has no universal dogmas by which this strain can be determined without observation of the particular facts of the case. So history, the application requiring going to the history, to the ontological part. For him, the application of the principle of economic discipline to any particular situation cannot ignore historical and empirical work. He noticed that facts by themselves are silent. Observation discovers nothing directly of the action of causes, but only of sequences in times. Facts must be interpreted, and their interpretation inevitably requires the use of theories. And this is another long quotation for Marshall. They do not throw a direct light on particular economic problems of our age. They do not in any way help us to dispense with the use of the economic organon. The organon are the general principle. But rather make use of its aid at every step. And those whose great achievement have made the school illustrious have never attempted to dispense with the aid of economic theory. It is against Cunningham and the German school. Thus, the attempt to assess the value of a theory by evaluating the realism of its conclusion instead of evaluating the realism of the assumption that must be introduced to make the theory coherent implies a rejection of martial scientific methodology. This is what we found in the literature, particularly in the last decades. Is dominant. This, according to Marshall, is making economics an ideological science, not a scientific science. Moreover, this methodology can lead to serious mistakes. For instance, the law of gravity, which is derived in abstract terms, implies the conclusion that all objects tend to move downwards. Probably, I don't know whether I bring, oh yes, that's right. Yet there are objects flying. Can we say that the law of gravity is not verified and must be abandoned because its conclusion is contradicted by the flight of an aircraft? No? So we must have a good relation between history and theory in this sense. The flight of an aircraft, let's say what I did here, something that I did it wrong. Oh, sorry. I'll get in there. Yes. The flight of an aircraft is also due to the air resistance, an element that is eliminated when the law of gravity is formulated in abstract terms. It is the knowledge of the law of gravity, which is the theoretical dimension, coupled with the air resistance, which is the ontological or historical dimension, that allows us to understand why an object flies and to design the wings of this object in such a way to make its flight more efficient. And this is the policy of the normative dimension. So we have the three elements always playing a role in the development of science. Keynes, I move now to Keynes, had a solid philosophical education and joined the economic profession under the guide of Marshall. He was very close to Marshall. He accepted his methodology, which characterized the Cambridge tradition. His father, John Neville Keynes, who contributed to his education, was a Cambridge philosopher working on the application of the scientific methodology of Marshall and Sidgwick. Since the 20s, John Maynard was the editor of the Cambridge textbook series. He wrote the introduction to this, the general introduction, providing a precisely description of Marshall's scientific methodologies. It's interesting to read this general introduction because they are very similar to Marshall writings. This approach was used during the preparation of the general theory, which is now completely forgotten. Nobody else read Keynes today. He's a great philosopher and economist. He really is quite important to understand the relation between theory, policy, and history and policy. The objective of the general theory was to revolutionize. I mean, he saw some empirical, some historical find, the crisis. Then he realized, was stimulated to say, I have to change my theory, the theoretical foundation. But then he tried to write a new book, 4 years of research to write this new book, no? How to change, how to revolutionize the neoclassical theoretical foundation of economics. The revolution of the foundation of the discipline required, first, the proposal of an alternative theoretical view. Second, a demonstration the neoclassical theory lacked logical coherence. And we need both elements if we want to construct a new theory, construct a new theoretical foundation of the discipline. We cannot just have one, we must have both. And Keynes was very conscious of that. The colleagues reading his work systematically demolished his attempts that Keynes made during the preparation of general theory to criticize the logical coherence of the neoclassical theory. He was able to produce a new alternative, but was not able to provide in such a short time a critical, the logical coherence of the neoclassical theory. Nonetheless, these attempts became more and more persistent as he went into the final stages of the preparation of the general theory. In summer 1934, he stated that this critique was necessary to persuade the profession to abandon the dominant school, whose trend was based on the acceptance of his theoretical principles. This is quite an important quotation from Keynes' preparation of the general theory. They, the heretics, believe that common observation is enough to show that facts do not conform to the orthodox reasoning, but they have made no impression on the citadel, the orthodox school. He thought it was part of the citadel. Cambridge was, and Marshall were the citadel. Indeed, many of them themselves accept the orthodox premises, and it's all because their flair is stronger than their logic. They do not want to accept his conclusion. This is very up-to-date quotation from Keynes. Should be applied to very lot of literature nowadays. Keynes then proceeded by saying that unlike the heretics, he was aware of the strength of the dominant school. He had been, I don't know why it does not move. Let's see. He had been brought up in the citadel and knew that it was absolutely necessary to attack it on its own premises in order to ask the profession to look at the economic problem in a radically new way. He claimed that he was convinced that there was a fatal flaw in the dominant reasoning and that he was on his way to demonstrate it. Then he concluded that if there was no mistakes in the logical coherence of the neoclassical school, then there was nothing to do. We had to accept it and develop policy, historical interpretation and policy on the base of what Mr. Anderson, Mr. Brand, and Professor Robbins, who were his enemy in the Treasury Review, were saying. Unfortunately, Keynes failed to give his criticism of the neoclassical theory a satisfactory basis before the publication of the general theory. This is what made the resurgence of the neoclassical synthesis. Yet, his insistence on a critique in terms of logical coherence, on the importance of general principle, and on the inability to refer to empirical facts to persuade the profession to abandon neoclassical theory testify to his accord with Marshallian scientific tradition. I would invite Professor Flynn to reconsider these crucial methodological debates on the relation between theory, history, and policy. His book is very stimulating from this point of view, but I think that this has to be worked out more, particularly at the beginning of the book, but to give it more strength to the critical arguments. Well, I don't know whether I still have time, because I'm trying to apply. Well, you stop me when it is too much. It's an application to the quantity theory. This will come next. I had some difficulty to understand in the book how Professor Flynn presents the quantity theory of money. No? I maintain the Fisher and the Cambridge versions only different for these two elements, the use of transaction and of product or of product in the theory, no? In the two different versions, and the objective of subjective interpretation of the demand for money, which are present in the two theory. I've not been able to understand well this part of Professor Flynn's presentation. I could not see in Professor Flynn's book the distinction between the quantity identity, which is being an identity all the time, and the equilibrium equation of Fisher and the Cambridge School version of the quantity theory. The quantity identity is in whatever form it is taken, Fisher or Cambridge School, is always valid. If for a moment we do not focus on the use of transaction or of product, T and X, we can move from one version to the other by defining the definition of V equal to 1 over K. The velocity of circulation is the opposite of the time expected, the time of detention of money. So we have we can use alternative this in the same way, this identity. Moving to the equilibrium equation, for instance, in the form M is equal K P X, we know that taking M as controlled by the monetary authority, we must add two more new equations to achieve the quantity theory conclusion that a change in the money supply generates a similar change in the price level. First equation, the economy is at full employment, which is accepting the Say's law, which if we go to the state of our knowledge in the economic discipline, the way it has developed during, for instance, the 20th century, we know that this is only valid when the economy produces one commodity. If produce more than one commodity, analytically, this does not hold this tendency. This is an analytical, there is a critique of the initial assumption of the theory. It's better to have a theory that assumes that there are more than one commodity produced, that have a theory that only produces one commodity. No, this is what I would criticize the quantity theory first. Then the other point is the value that K can assume, the demand for money for each unit of income produced. No? We have to assume that has not varied when the authority implement a restrictive monetary policy and when the monetary income produce varies. We know that if the authority try to implement a restrictive policy, K start to become very unstable. And this is not present in the quantity theory. Well, from this perspective, Fisher and the Cambridge School version of the quantity theory lead to the same result which is critical in analytical terms. As it is known, the difference between the two versions can be found in the use of transaction and the objective or subjective interpretation of the value of K. Let's hope. Well, okay. Just one final consideration. Ricardo pointed out that when we have gold standard and gold as a cost of production, we can use the quantity identity to determine the money supply that the economy requires to keep it working smoothly, rather than the price level, because the price level depends on the cost of production of gold. with respect to the other goods. And we have a lot of analytical development on that, which are in terms of simultaneous equation, not in terms of demand and supply on a single market. Otherwise, we cannot take out this kind of situation or solution. To conclude, the problems to quantity theory in whatever version can be found in the additional assumption 1 and 2 mentioned above, and the initial assumptions that required to make these two other assumptions logically coherent. This means that to give the theory logical coherence, we must accept that the economy tends to full employment or to its output potential, which is also used in the new consensus in macroeconomics, and that the contact of monetary policy does not influence financial innovation. Thank you. I hope it will not be too long.
Thank you very much, Carlo, for your criticisms. Very good to discuss. Well, now the turn is from Gustavo del Ángel. He's research professor at CIDE, Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica. This academic year, he's visiting scholar at the Institute of Historical Research in the UNAM and fellow of Princeton University. He also is external research associate at the Espinosa Iglesia Center, and he was president of, of the Mexican Historical Association, Economic Historical Association. He's member of the Mexican Academy of Science. Thank you very much, Gustavo, for coming.
Well, thank you, Antonio, for the invitation. And well, I would like to thank you especially for inviting us to read some parts of a very interesting book by Professor Flynn, a recognized economic historian and monetary historian and economist. So the book is, or the part of the books that I read are quite interesting. And well, so I am gonna do specific comments on what I read. And I think the especially about the introductory chapter, and that covers most of the book. The introductory chapter explains a theory and historical evidence supporting that theory. It's a nice text that describes and I say it's a nice text because it describes the process of discovery as a personal journey. And I really like that. How did I get to this idea? How this idea developed over time? So how were all these personal relations that helped me to develop this idea? Because as we know, there is always a personal and social component in the creation of knowledge, specifically and in particular of scientific knowledge. So I really appreciate that part of the narrative. First, I want to talk a little bit about the historical evidence. I enjoy the analysis of the historical evidence, which mostly is about the role of money, bullion money, gold, mostly silver, that went to Europe via Spain, from Spanish America, and mostly Mexico, the New Spain, and Peru. And whether or not that flow of new bullion affected prices in Europe in the 17th century. That is, it caused the price revolution. And for that, we have the debate by Hamilton, who, using his work, well, mostly it was his and his wife's work, actually their work, and the research reconstructing historical series of exports of bullion from New Spain to Europe, he argued that such flow was the cause of the 17th century price revolution in Europe. This using basically the quantitative theory of money, as it was mentioned by my colleagues. But that argument was later contested by Carlo Cipolla, who found a gap in the flows of silver and gold and in the trend of prices. And this was especially in the kingdoms that later constitute Italy. And there is an argument, a central argument of the book, that is to propose a theory, the theory of demands and supplies. And this can be, well, this is, as the book explains, a contribution about the model, the traditional model of supply and demand. So the central idea is that the traditional model of supply and demand does not account for goods that experience accumulation over time. And that changes the nature of the market. Accumulation changes the nature of the market. And hence the explanatory power of this, let's say, traditional model. The chapter, the introductory chapter initially discusses the validity of the quantitative theory of money, and I think Carlo elaborated much deeper into that in his comment. So this chapter initially discusses this validity of the quantitative theory of money. This explaining how the inflow of bullion money in Europe caused the 17th century inflation of the price revolution. And I have two comments about this. Certainly, nobody now believes in the quantitative theory of money as a sole explanation for inflation. I mean, neither in the absolute neutrality of money. Inflation, as we know, can be the consequence of many causes, and including monetary ones. That's for sure, but it's not the only cause. But I am sure that the mainstream economics, the mainstream neoclassical economics right now has moved from monetarism or traditional monetarism, hard monetarism, which assumed a version of the quantitative theory of money. And that happened a long time ago. And it's not that current mainstream economics does not fully reject the quantitative theory of money, but just leaves the question open. And I think that to some extent that part is, I mean, I really like that part, but I think it distracted me. I think it distracts the reader. But of course, it's justified in the text as an instrumental to use another approach to explaining the monetary problem in 16th and 17th century Europe and Spanish America, which is the monetary approach to the balance of payment. So as far as the monetary approach of the monetary problem, this is the comment I have. But then there is the argument about the accumulation in supply and demand. So there are two things I want to comment from my reading. First is that the author could be more contundent in explaining to me, or explaining in general, how a traditional supply and demand model will react and probably fail in explaining goods that can be accumulated. Second, when reading the chapter, I was thinking that accumulation can work in the traditional model if assimilated in the elasticities of supply and demand, mostly price elasticity, but also income elasticity of supply and demand. And in fact, according to the functions and to the curve that the author shows in the text, there is an effect on elasticity. But then, as the author explains accumulation over time and how accumulation is also a historical process, I realized that the problem is more complex. And indeed, it deserves more thinking. And the argument of the author gains more value to explain, to use a special form of supply, the special form of supply. And for this, there are two important strategies that the author uses. First is the segmentation of supply and demand into different types of supply and demand, where purchase, ownership, and consumption demand, and production, ownership, and sales supply. And this is a central part of his argument. This is a medullary part. So, and the second strategy is the use of different examples in addition to the case under study, that is the monetary problems in 16th and 17th century Europe and Spanish America. And there are two arguments I really like. One is the use of the housing market, and the other is the use of the example of accumulation of water. So accumulation over time has important implications in the market. So, and that implication is that history matters, or what happened in the past matters to shape the markets, or to shape how the markets work. This goes in parallel direction, or in the same direction of the logic of evolutionary economics and path dependence. That is a cumulative process that generates different outcomes in a non-linear way. Also, the segmentation of demand and supply, as we mentioned, this purchase, ownership, and consumption demand especially, has a connection with the sociology of markets. And that is and this makes the argument more interesting. When talking about money as a good or as something that is traded, is also interesting because it relates to the institutional nature of money, and that is also interesting. I am not asking Professor Flynn to include this in the book, but I am just suggesting that maybe in some part, could be discussed that the institutional nature of money can be, or this, that the argument is also related to this, to the sociology of money, the institutional nature of money, that some of us study, especially when referring to different types of money that circulated in that time in Spanish America and in Europe. I think you refer to the different types of money that existed, but this is also explained by institutional studies about money and money markets. Well, these are my comments. I know you guys, everybody's waiting for the lunchtime, so I try to be brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. We have the point of view about the problem, two schools of economic talk. And if you want, Dennis, a brief response to the comments.
Okay.
It's okay for you?
Sure.
Okay.
I would love to do that.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So, is it not on?
It's okay.
It's on. Okay. Two commentators mentioned evolutionary economics. I'm not an expert on evolutionary economics, but my professor, my last year undergraduate, 2 years in a master's program, the reason I became an economist was Glenn Atkinson. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he's a dear friend to this day. So I'm very much influenced by institutional economics, even though I don't know enough about it to say whether I'm an institutional economist or not, but I thought that was quite interesting. A quick thing that wasn't brought up, but I have it in front of me, I didn't mention it before, is that when there's a purchase in my model, when there's a purchase of a good, I consider them both wealth components, and they're exchanging wealth components. So the overall wealth of the buyer is the same as before, and the seller is the same as before, right? But when there's a purchase of a service, wealth goes one direction, right? The person who buys the service gives up a wealth component, money, and does not get something that's can be accumulated in return. Anyway, I think it's an important distinction, because in the United States and probably every other economy in the world too, something like 75% of GDP is services. And we're so happy and proud to be an advanced economy. And my reaction is, oh, really? So not producing wealth is you're proud of that? I'm surprised to hear that. Just let me grab a couple of other ones. There were well, I really wish I knew 10% of what you know about the history of economic thought, because I've always wanted to go into that, but I've only brushed around the edges because I just only have one life. But I think the history of thought cannot and should not ever be left out of the picture, and I really appreciate all of those kind of comments. I think and you make. I'd love to even have your PowerPoints, because they're a lifetime of taking these huge numbers of complex arguments and distilling them down, and I think they're very useful. In terms of the assumptions, I totally agree that the assumptions are critical, and the crucial assumption that, in fact, the source of my model is the assumption that there are two sources of utility, not just consumption, but ownership also. And I mean, that spins you in a completely different direction, right? Whereas standard economics, I mean, I'd say, well, even the word consumers, we talk about, I even said just a minute ago that 75% of GDP is, well, I said services, but roughly about 70% also is so-called consumption, right? But what I try to point out here is that no, that's a conflation of purchase and consumption, which are not the same thing, right? And so I know I'm a heretic. I agree with that part for sure. But I'm going to be spending however many years left I have trying to convince people, historians, to just do something that's really quite simple. Say customers, please, rather than consumers, because a lot of the goods that are purchased are not consumable goods in the way that my model defines it, which I think is the common sense. If somebody says you consume the beer, it's in your stomach. It's not no longer in the can, right? And so it reduces, and most of the goods that we buy, or at least a lot of them, are not consumable goods whatsoever. This is not consumable. We use it and it's still there afterwards, right? And so this kind of model, did I start out with all of these conclusions? I didn't start out with any of them. It was just the interplay between the history, the induction, the deduction, which is basically what we're talking about, and why I feel as strongly as any of you do that that leaving history out of the picture, which is what modern economics does in the United States, I won't speak for the rest of the world, but in the United States, they think that history is irrelevant. And I say, no, you're irrelevant. I know that's not a very polite thing to say. And you can see why I don't have very many invitations coming from standard economists for sure. And that's okay with me.
Thank you very much, Professor Flynn, for your visit. We have very happy to you here. We expect the book is publishing and when?
I hope next year.
Okay.
But I haven't signed a contract yet. I'm talking to two different publishers and I'm trying to decide. One of them said that once we get everything together, I would hope by the end of January, that it could hit print in 6 months.
Okay.
I'm very interested in that. Will it happen? I don't know.
Okay.
But that would be very fast because other publishers, that's one of the reasons why I want to go. This would be Palgrave. But the other publishers, more traditional, and who knows, I don't, I next month I turn 80. I mean, I want this thing out, I look at the actuarial tables, right?
Okay.
I mean, come on. And so 2 years from now, no. I want it to be next year. I hope.
Thank you very much for a preview of the problems of your book. And thank you for the comments. And thank you. Maybe Gustavo was right this time lunch, or you have any question? Okay. Time lunch? Or maybe in the lunch? Okay. Thank you very much. ¿No? Buenas tardes. Hasta luego.